Good morning. I'm so glad you could be with me today as we have another time in God's Word together in the Unfolding the Word series. If you've been with me, you know we've been in the book of Daniel. We're in the 4th chapter now. Today I want to pick up our reading in verse 4 through verse 9. I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at ease in my house, prospering in my palace. I saw a dream that made me afraid. As I lay in bed, the fancies and the visions of my head alarmed me. And so I made a decree that all the wise men of Babylon should be brought before me, that they might make known to me the interpretation of the dream. And then the magicians, the enchanters, the Chaldeans, and the astrologers came in, and I told them the dream. But they could not make known to me its interpretation. At last Daniel came in before me, he who was named Belteshazzar, after the name of my God, and in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. I told him the dream, saying, O Belteshazzar, chief of the magicians, because I know that the spirit of the holy gods is in you, and that no mystery is too difficult for you, tell me the visions of my dream that I saw and their interpretation. Now you remember the 4th chapter, this final chapter dealing with Nebuchadnezzar within the book of Daniel, has been a chapter in which the king, Nebuchadnezzar, is in retrospect telling us a story of how God, through a dream, warned him of a coming discipline for his pride, how he refused to listen, and then went through a 7-year period of madness. He's now, after that period, telling us the consequences, telling us the results and the lessons. In fact, yesterday we looked at the 2 summary lessons that he told us before he goes back and begins to describe the events themselves. He told us that out of this period, this 7+ years of madness, that he came to the point, came to his senses, and understood that Jehovah is the one true God, the Most High God. And then secondly, that it is God's kingdom that is the eternal kingdom, the lasting kingdom from generation to generation, contrary to his goals and intention to make his descendants continuing the kingdom that he began. Now, the verses I read today, starting in verse 4, are now looking back at least 8 years from the time this is written, probably a little bit more, but at least 8 years, because they go back to that period of time when the dream came, and there was a year's time after the dream before the punishment, the discipline was implemented. So it's at least 8 years. We see in these opening verses of verses 4 and 5 something about the life circumstances of King Nebuchadnezzar when these events all began. It tells us very clearly here, he was at ease in his house and prospering in his palace. He was prosperous. He was contented. He was a godless and rebellious man. But that didn't necessarily mean that life wasn't seemingly working out for him. I was thinking of Psalm 73 in this regard. In verses 4 and 5, let me read these to you. He says, describing the wicked, the rebels against God, who despite that seem to be prosperous in this life. He says, for they have no pangs until death. Their bodies are fat and sleek, and they're not in trouble as others are. They're not stricken like the rest of mankind, and therefore pride is their necklace. Boy, what an apt description of Nebuchadnezzar. The king was happy with his life. The king was confident in his control over his circumstances, confident in his control over the whole empire, and confident that he could still influence the future, even though God had gone out of his way to make it plain to Nebuchadnezzar that it is God alone who is the Lord of history. Looking back this 8+ years to that time of prosperity, King Nebuchadnezzar understands that he was a fool, a lost fool during that period. I was thinking of Luke chapter 12 and verses 19 to 21, where Jesus tells us the parable of the rich fool. Listen to these words. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Eat, relax, drink, be merry. See, remember, Nebuchadnezzar was at ease in his home, prospering in his palace. But God said to him, Fool, this night your soul is required of you. And the things that you prepared, whose will they be? So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. Nebuchadnezzar was not rich toward God during this particular time that he's looking back on, at least 8 years prior to the point that he's writing. In the midst of his prideful contentment, in the midst of his false confidence in his own abilities and his own control over life, God sends Nebuchadnezzar a dream. And this dream unsettles his confidence, unsettles his hope, and unsettles his satisfaction and contentment. Much like chapter 2, you remember. The dream left him terrified and feeling out of control. He specifically said, it made me afraid. It alarmed me. And so suddenly, Nebuchadnezzar moves out of this contented ease into fear and alarm. But even as that happens, we see in the way that he goes about trying to answer the problem that he specifically excludes Daniel at first. His pride, sinful pride, prevented him from bringing in the leader of the Magi order, the second in power within the whole empire, Daniel. Despite his distress, he calls the rest of the Magi order in. There are 4 divisions of that order: the magicians, the enchanters, the Chaldeans, and astrologers. And to try to distinguish between them today is beyond the purpose of my teaching to you, but nonetheless, the broad order of the wise men, of the think tank of the era, was made up of these 4 groups. And he brings all of those people in, at least the leaders of them, and he presents to them the dream. He actually tells them the dream. And he says, listen, contrary to chapter 2, you remember, where he didn't tell them the dream. Here now he tells them the dream, and he says, now interpret it for me, and they can't do it. They can't help him, because some things are beyond human ability. And God had determined no human being was going to understand the dream, only the human being he gives the interpretation to, which of course was going to be Daniel. At last, in distress and in desperation in a way, because his other avenues for solution were gone, King Nebuchadnezzar swallows his pride, eats humble pie, and asks Daniel to come before him. And he calls Daniel both Daniel and Belteshazzar. Now, why was he increasing and using Daniel's name here? I suspect using his Hebrew name as well as his Babylonian name to maybe curry his favor, maybe make God willing to give him the answer to this dream that was so troubling. We don't know. But at any rate, as he brings Daniel before him, he says 2 things. Number 1, he acknowledges Daniel's true position. He says, chief of the order. He had called all the rest of the order and he ignored the chief. Now he brings in the chief, a position, by the way, Nebuchadnezzar himself had promoted him to, you remember? So he brings him in, and there's a certain humility in this, you recognize. Come in now, chief of this order. And as he's describing Daniel and telling us a bit about him and making the request of Daniel, he acknowledges in a way where the source of the answer to interpret the dream was going to come from, because he says about Daniel that he was one in whom the spirit of the holy gods was, that he had the spirit of the holy gods, and no mystery therefore was something he couldn't give an answer to. He's begrudgingly admitting that this dream is going to require God to give some information. Doesn't mean he's happy about it. I believe it was begrudging here. But in desperation, he's willing to get the message, and he's asking Daniel to, in mercy and care, take that message that God is likely to give him and explain the dream to the king. He's moved from ease in his house, prospering in his palace, contented, happy, and confident in his control, to begrudgingly admitting that he needs God's help, that he's going to have to be dependent on the very prophet of God in his era, Daniel, to help him get to the bottom of what he was facing. The slide and move from pride into humility had already begun. At any rate, he's got Daniel before him now, and his next step, which we'll look at tomorrow, is to tell Daniel the dream. And then, hopefully, Daniel will tell him the interpretation. Join me then, won't you? God bless.